Hello everyone, and welcome to my remake of my read aloud of Captain Underpants and the sensational saga of Sir Stinks-a-Lot. Now this is probably going to be the final read aloud that I'm making for a while, until more new books from series I like come out, so yeah. And why I had to remake this is the same as the last videos I made on this, because when I first read this book I did not receive the full color version, but now I have the full color version in my hands, and you're watching it now, so yeah. Anyways, let's begin. Full color, Captain Underpants and the sensational saga of Sir Stinks-a-Lot. Well, here we are again, in big trouble as usual. We've had so much bad luck lately, we had to make this comic so we could keep it all straight. Behold our graphic tale of misery and woe. Captain Underpants, the 100% true truth. Once upon a time, there was two cool kids named George and Harold. They were smart and handsome and stuff. Yes, thank you, we know. Me too. But they had the meanest principal ever. Name of Mr. Krupp. Blah, blah, blah. One time Mr. Krupp was being mean. You will follow my rules. So they hypnotized him. Not today, bub. Mr. Krupp was under George and Harold's spell. You are now Captain Underpants. Okay, it was funny at first. Ha 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 ha! Look at me! But it got really dangerous really quick. Tra-la-la! Then one day, Mr. Krupp drank some Mountain Dew, alien superpower juice, and he got real superpowers. Now, whenever Mr. Krupp hears somebody snap their fingers, snap, he turns into Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la! And whenever Captain Underpants gets water on his head, he turns back into Mr. Krupp. Blah, blah, blah! So we got that to deal with, but it gets worse. One day, George and Harold had a really big problem. I got you now! So they borrowed a time machine, and they went back in time to fix the problem. Hooray! We're smart. But they created a totally new problem. Oh no! We accidentally made doubles of ourselves. When their teachers saw two Georges and two Harolds, they all went crazy. We must be dreaming. Let's get naked. Yeehaw! Whoopee! Oh no! My eyes! They burn! So they all had to go to the mental hospital. The only good thing that happened is that we got 3 new pets. They are half bionic hamsters and half pterodactyls. This is Tony, that's Orlando, and that one is Dawn. It's been a few weeks since our last adventure. The city has been rebuilt, and things are getting back to normal. But there are still lots of loose ends to our story. As Grandpa would say in Big Jim Begins, they had more loose ends than a spaghetti dinner. That can only mean one thing. Another sequel. Oh no! Here we go again. Chapter 1. George and Harold and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins and Harold Hutchins. George and George are the kids on the left with the ties and the flat tops. Harold and Harold are the ones on the right with the t-shirts and the bad haircuts. Remember that now. Chapter 2. The GOP Guarantee. Some restrictions may apply. Void where prohibited. If you read our last adventure, you're probably well aware of how George and Harold accidentally created duplicates versions of themselves. You know all the whys, the whens, and the wherefores, so you're all caught up and ready to go. Congratulations! Good for you. Reading is power, ain't it? If you didn't read our last adventure, you're probably scratching your head and saying to yourself, "Hey myself, what the heck is going on here?" Before we get into all that, I should point out that it's impolite to use the word heck. These books have been criticized for their inappropriate language, and we're going to put a stop to that sort of thing once and for all. From now on, except on pages 44 and 48, you won't be reading any more words like heck or tinkle or fart or pee-pee. No, sir. Those words are highly offensive to grouchy old people who have way too much time on their hands. We demand representation and hard candies. In the interest of pleasing all the grouchy old people or GOP out there, I have also included topics especially for them. So this adventure will contain references to healthcare, gardening, Bob Evans restaurants, hard candies, Fox News, and gentle yet effective laxatives. So sit back on your hemorrhoid pillows, turn up some music, Lawrence Welk, and grab a snack. Black jelly beans are all stuck together. It's time to enjoy the all-new, squeaky clean, fully appropriate, and non-offensive adventures of Captain Underpants. Chapter 3. The Species Who Knew Too Much. We all know that it's good to be smart, but it's even better to be very smart. But being too smart is just asking for trouble. Take human beings, for example. We were smart enough to invent gardening and healthcare, we developed Bob Evans restaurants and Fox News, and we've managed to take hard candies and gentle yet effective laxatives to exciting new horizons. But somewhere along the way, we got too smart for our own good. We started inventing dumb things like car alarms, leaf blowers, and spray-on hair. Wee-oo, honk, 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 vrr, sss. You'd think that dumb things would have been good enough for us, but no, our big ridiculous brains just weren't satisfied. We had to take things one step further, so we began incredibly dangerous things like atomic bombs and nuclear warheads, and we built enough of them to wipe out everybody on the planet. Then, like the smarty pants as we are, we handed the launch codes over to politicians. Only human beings are smart enough to be that dumb. It turns out that brains are a lot like beans. They're both good, but you really don't want to overdo it with either one. You see, too much of a good thing usually ends up being a very bad thing. One way or another, you're probably going to end up with a big, stinky mess. The story you are about to read is the unfortunate tale of how the smartest brain on the planet created the biggest, stinkiest mess the world has ever seen. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. And the sign this guy is holding says, "We're smart," but it's upside down and the S is backwards. Chapter 4, Smart Earth. As any scientist will tell you, we exist in an ever-expanding multiverse with an infinite number of stars and planets. One of those planets, which orbits around the center star in Orion's belt, is called Smart Earth. Smart Earth is almost identical to our Earth, except that everybody who lives on Smart Earth is a genius. The reason everybody on Smart Earth is so smart is that the entire planet is made of an element called Zygogogozizzle-24. Zygogogozizzle-24 is a slightly radioactive substance that combined with organic matter, morph into complex organisms, and be mixed with mayonnaise and dill pickle relish to create both a tasty salad dressing and a clean-burning fuel source with enough power to light up an entire city. One of the remarkable side effects of being in close proximity to the Zygogogozizzle-24 is that it makes people much, much smarter than they would normally be. Even though Smart Earth is inhabited by geniuses, it still has a lot of similarities to our Earth. They've got McDonald's, though it's called Smart McDonald's, they have smartphones, which are called Smart Smartphones, and they've got the Huffington Post, which is called the Huffington Post. One day, a smart scientist at Smart Harvard University decided to do a smart experiment. It was the smartest, most intelligent experiment that anyone at Smart Earth had ever conducted. It was so incredibly smart, in fact, that it ended up being totally dumb. That smart afternoon in her smart laboratory, smarter scientists mixed smart Diet Coke with smart Pop Rocks. Okay, I should stop saying the word smart here. How many times have I said it? Then she added a third ingredient to this highly volatile concoction. Smart Mentos. This is what happened. Chimbalushi! Chapter 5, Lego My Zygogogozizzle-24. The explosion that followed sent chunks of Zygogogozizzle-24 whizzing off in different directions throughout the galaxy and beyond. One piece of Zygogogozizzle-24 landed in a pond on the nearby planet Bad Pun, causing all the pond water to turn into smart pond water. Plip! Soon the fish in the pond became so intelligent they started swimming in schools. Get it? Another piece of Zygogogozizzle-24 ended up landing in a grape vineyard on planet Pinot. The Zygogogozizzle-24 was quickly absorbed into the soil and was subsequently soaked up into the grapes. Wham! These grapes, which had until recently been harvested almost to extinction, suddenly became self-aware and super intelligent. They banded together in bunches and rose up to defeat their oppressors. The battle lasted one whole night, but sadly it ended the next morning when the sun came up. The rebellion shriveled when the poor grapes ran out of juice. Apparently, there's a reason for everything. Get it? The rise of the planet of the grapes. Perhaps the most devastating result of the destruction of Smart Earth, however, occurred when a tiny piece of Zygogogozizzle-24 entered our own planet's atmosphere. It soared down through the sky at terrific speed, zooming closer and closer to the small midwestern town of Piqua, Ohio. Crash! Finally, the tiny chunk of Zygogogozizzle-24 crashed through the roof of the Piqua Valley home for the reality challenged. It landed in the group therapy ward, where all the teachers from the nearby elementary school had recently been transferred. "What's that?" cried Mr. Krupp. "Looks like a meteorite," said Ms. Ribble. "Don't touch it," warned the doctor. "It might be the blob." The doctor's warning was heeded by everyone except for the gym teacher, Mr. Meaner. Gym teachers, as I'm sure you are all aware, are a lot like toddlers. You really have to keep an eye on them because they're always picking things up off the floor and putting them in their mouths. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened on that fateful day at the Pequot Valley home for the reality challenged. Said Mr. Meaner as he happily chewed up the Zygogogozizzle 24 and swallowed hard. Tastes like chicken. Chapter 6, The Trouble with Zizzles. Suddenly, the tiny chunk of Zygogogozizzle 24 began to bind with Mr. Meaner's stomach lining. It started taking over his cells at an alarming rate, spreading throughout his squishy innards and overriding his normal bodily functions. Soon, the Zygogogozizzle 24 reached Mr. Meaner's mind, where it supercharged all of his brain cells and began the complicated process of making him smart. "Are you all right, Mr. Meaner?" asked the psychologist. "You look a little strange." "I'm much more than all right," replied Mr. Meaner. "I'm exceptionally impeccable." Mr. Meaner's fellow teachers looked worried. They had never heard him use anything larger than a 3-syllable word before. Usually, Mr. Meaner just pointed at things and grunted. I think you'd better sit down," said the psychologist. "Nonsense, my good man," said Mr. Meaner as his mind's neurons and glial cells began restructuring themselves, forming new concoctions and making his brain smarter and smarter each second. "I've wasted far too much time in this insipid infirmary already. Now, wait just a minute," said the psychologist. "You can't leave here. You're a patient." "On the contrary," said Mr. Meaner, who now spoke in a standard British accent, "I shall walk right out that door expeditiously, and neither you nor anyone else is going to stop me." "Help! Emergency!" shouted the psychologist. "We've got a runner!" Another doctor rushed in to help. Together, the two doctors blocked the exit and refused to budge. "You're not going anywhere, bub," said the psychologist. Mr. Meaner smirked as he looked at the two doctors with pity. This was going to be too easy. Chapter 7, A Paradox for a Pair of Docs. Mr. Meaner approached the two doctors. "I have some advice for the both of you," said Mr. Meaner. "Well, too bad," said the psychologist, "because we're not going to follow any of your advice." "Is that so?" asked Mr. Meaner. "And I advise you to not follow my advice." The two doctors were confused. "Well, we're not going to follow that advice," said the psychologist. "But if we don't follow his advice to not follow his advice," said the other doctor, "then aren't we following his advice?" "Wait a minute," said the psychologist. "What if we follow his advice to not follow his advice? Are we still following his advice?" The two doctors became so entangled in their deep, paradoxical conversation that they didn't even notice Mr. Meaner walking out the exit door. "Hey, now's our chance to escape too," said Ms. Ribble. The other teachers followed her out the door, right past the increasingly confused and frustrated doctors. All of the teachers and staff of Jerome Horowitz Elementary School were now free. They followed Mr. Meaner up to the hilltop and watched him in awe as he looked out over the horizon. Most people in Mr. Meaner's position would use their newfound genius brains to end world hunger and bring peace to humanity. But these were the last things on Mr. Meaner's magnificent mind. Mr. Meaner was still a gym teacher at heart, you see, and as everyone knows, most gym teachers are inherently evil. Chapter 8, Why Can't We Be Fiends? "It occurs to me," said Mr. Meaner, "that all our recent problems have all been caused by willful and disobedient children." "I heard that," said Mr. Krupp. "Silence, you fool," said Mr. Meaner. Mr. Meaner shouted. "If we are to rectify this aberration, we must proceed with prudence and acumen." "I'm not sure what those words mean," said Miss Anthrop, "but I agree 139%. "Me too," said the other teachers simultaneously. "Then you must follow my every command," said Mr. Meaner. "You must all return to your jobs and go about your business as usual. Nothing is to look suspicious." But we want to be evil too," Misdirected whined. "Patience, my dear minions," said Mr. Meaner with a hideous sneer. "There will be plenty of time for that in the days to come." Chapter 9, Crimes of Mr. Meaner. Get it? A few days later, school was back in session. The teachers taught, the students studied. Student and teacher art fair starts Wednesday. And the sign now reads, "Teacher farts stain underwear." And George and Harold went back to their mischief. After school, George and Harold climbed up into their treehouse to do their homework. The yesterday versions of themselves, which were established in the last book, were busy playing video games and reading comics. "How was school today?" asked yesterday George. "Meh," said George. "Did you learn anything new?" asked yesterday Harold. Said Harold, shrugging. By all appearances, things had finally returned to normal. But at night, Mr. Meaner tinkered away at a makeshift laboratory inside an old abandoned factory near Franz Pond. He was developing a powerful mind control potion that would turn even the most unruly child into a brainlessly obedient conformist. Using a base mixture of sodium thiopental, Mr. Meaner added liberal doses of butyric acid, tryptophan, and clamato juice. Then he filtered the solution through an old dirty pile of stinky gym socks. The concoction smelled terrible, but its sinister effect would be even worse. "My formula is now ready for human trials," said Mr. Meaner, "and I know exactly which 2 humans I'm going to try it out on." Chapter 10, Spray Day. The next day, Mr. Meaner showed up at school looking a little different than usual. He still wore the same smelly sweatshirt and sweatpants he had on all week, nothing new there, but somehow something about him had changed. It was yesterday George and yesterday Harold's turn to go to school and do homework that day, so the boys dutifully went to their classes and did everything they were supposed to do. Join us for Wednesday's math chat. The sign now reads "Enjoy a fart sandwich," and a few things they were not supposed to do, like changing up the letters on the sign. Everything seemed normal until after gym class. Mr. Meaner excused the rest of the kids, but not yesterday George and yesterday Harold. "Boys," said Mr. Meaner, "I'd like to see you in my office pronto." "Why?" asked yesterday George. "We didn't do anything." "Probably." Mr. Meaner pointed to his office door. "In my office now," he shouted. No pain, no fun. Yesterday George and yesterday Harold slinked into Mr. Meaner's filthy office. They'd been in there before and they hated the smell of it. It reeked of mold, rat urine, and the putrid sweat of 1,000 tormented souls. But today, for some strange reason, it smelled even worse than usual. Yesterday George and yesterday Harold climbed into 2 sticky vinyl chairs and held their breath. "Well, well, well," said Mr. Meaner as he closed the door behind him and approached our heroes. "It looks like we're alone at last." "What's going on here?" asked yesterday George suspiciously. "Yeah," said yesterday Harold. "We've got to go to our next class." "Oh, there'll be plenty of time for classes and studying and homework," replied Mr. Meaner. "But first, I'd like you to help me out with a little experiment." Mr. Meaner lifted his arms, revealing 2 metallic spray nozzles under his crusty pits. "Say hello to my stinky friends," he laughed as the nozzle spattered out 2 brown cloudbursts of choking noxious stank. Chapter 11, ASLS, Attention Superfluous Lethargy Syndrome. You've probably all heard of ADHD. It's a condition known as Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. George and Harold had been diagnosed with it when they were in the 2nd grade. At the time, George's dad had explained to the boys that people with ADHD are usually more creative than ordinary people. This made George and Harold feel very special, and they wore their diagnoses like a badge of honor. But today, as they walked down the hallway to their next class, the boys felt much different than normal. It was almost as if their ADHD had been dramatically reversed somehow. They felt focused and attentive. They were calm and orderly. They did not feel the uncontrollable urge to daydream or misbehave. Something had changed about them. "You're late for class!" shouted their math teacher and needed a calculator. "We are very sorry," said yesterday Harold robotically. "Just for that, I'm going to give you extra homework," Miss Calculator snarled. "Thank you, dear teacher," said yesterday George in an enthusiastic monotone. "That would be lovely." Miss Calculator eyed the 2 boys suspiciously as they found their way to their desks and sat down quietly. All through class, as she droned on, she observed the most peculiar things she had ever seen. Yesterday George and yesterday Harold were actually sitting still and paying attention. They weren't fidgeting, they weren't giggling, and they weren't drawing or talking or making irritating noises with their armpits. They had become model students. "I don't know what you 2 boys are up to," said Miss Calculator at the end of class, "but I like it." "Thank you," said yesterday George. "Our greatest desire is to please you." "That is right," said yesterday Harold. "And thank you for all the extra homework, too. We will do our very best." Even Melvin Sneedley was impressed. "Those guys are cooler than I thought," said Melvin. All through the day, yesterday George and yesterday Harold were making quite an impression on the faculty of Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. The teachers couldn't believe it when the 2 boys walked right past a bulletin board without changing the letters around. "They could have easily rearranged those letters to read 'Our cafeteria makes you barf,'" said Miss Guided. "But they didn't. I don't know what's going on with those 2 kids," said Miss Labeler. "But I like it. Try our cafeteria's fun, make a taco bar." At the end of the school day, yesterday George and yesterday Harold went around to each classroom, asking if they could do extra credit homework that evening. The teachers gladly piled it on. "I don't know what you did to those two brats today," said Mr. Krupp, "but I like it." "This is only the beginning," Mr. Meaner sneered. "Today I changed George and Harold. Soon I shall change the world." Unlike most megalomaniacs, Mr. Meaner had no interest in taking over the planet. He was smarter than that. He knew that the real money and power was in pharmaceuticals. Mr. Meaner had created a formula that transformed children into highly attentive, obedient servants. All he needed to do was mass market his creation, and he would become the most powerful entity on Earth. "Adults will pay through the nose for that kind of thing," he said with a laugh, petting Mr. Krupp's head affectionately. "But for now, the first taste is free." Chapter 12. Men at Work. That afternoon, Yesterday George and Yesterday Harold climbed up into the treehouse with so much homework they had to make 2 trips to hoist it all up. "Whoa!" shouted George. "What happened today?" "It was a great day," said Yesterday Harold. "The teachers were so kind they gave us 17 pounds of homework." "17 pounds of homework!" shouted Harold. "We're doomed!" "No, we are not," said Yesterday George. "We can all work on it together. It will be fun." George and Harold looked at each other in horror. Never in a million years would they have used the words homework and fun in the same sentence. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" whispered George. "Body snatchers," whispered Harold. "Yep," whispered George. The 4 boys sat at their table and began tackling their assignments. Yesterday George and Yesterday Harold plowed through page after page worksheets and take-home quizzes at a dizzying rate. George and Harold tried to keep up, but they kept getting distracted. At supper time, Yesterday George and Yesterday Harold went down to their homes to eat with their families. An hour later, they went back up to the treehouse to continue their work. "We brought some extra food for you," said Yesterday Harold. "Thanks," said George and Harold. Everyone worked until it was time for bed. "We have completed our half to the best of our ability," said Yesterday George. George and Harold hadn't even made a dent in their half. "We're going to be working on this all night," moaned Harold. "I have a satisfactory suggestion," said Yesterday George. "You 2 boys finish your work tonight, and we will go to school again tomorrow." "Really?" said George. "You'll go to school 2 days in a row?" "Nobody should have to endure that," cried Harold. "We do not mind," said Yesterday George and Yesterday Harold simultaneously. "We love school." So while Yesterday George and Yesterday Harold slept in their beds, George and Harold stayed up until 5 a.m. answering questions, filling in blanks, and showing their work. "Man, I'm wiped out," said George. "If this keeps up, we're going to get sick." "I'm already getting sick," said Harold as he blew his nose. Chapter 13. The Stinky Kong 2000. The next day, Mr. Meaner looked even more different than he had the day before. He'd been building a mechanical suit in his laboratory, and each new morning it got more and more elaborate. The genius gym teacher started the day by spraying all of the children in his classes with his newest mind control formula, Riddle Kid 2000, trademarked. "Say hello to my stinky friend," shouted Mr. Meaner with each squirt. In no time at all, the entire student body of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School was transformed. Now every kid in the school had attention superfluous lethargy syndrome. "This is wonderful!" Mr. Krupp exclaimed. "There's no more laughing, no more daydreaming, and no more running or playing or goofing around." "I would hate to live in that world." "It's like you've crushed their spirits and their imaginations in one fell swoop." "I'm really doing the world a great service," Mr. Meaner said with a slithery smile. "I'm raising a new generation of totally compliant button pushers. They'll do what they're told, they won't question authority, and best of all, no complaining." "Yeah, but isn't Riddle Kid 2000 trademark dangerous?" asked Miss Ribble. "Not for us," said Mr. Meaner. "The spray only affects children. Adults are totally immune, so it's perfectly safe. The only downside to Mr. Meaner's intranasally absorbed spray is that it only lasted for 24 hours. To be completely effective, it needed to be resprayed every day. That's the beauty of my system," said Mr. Meaner. "Once parents see how easy it is to control children, they'll pay anything for a daily fix." Chapter 14. And now, a word from our sponsor. As the week progressed, George and Harold got more and more swamped with homework. They stayed up later and later each night and got sicker and sicker. "Let's take a break and watch some TV," said George one morning as he wiped his nose. "Okay," said Harold with a sneeze. George turned on the TV and flipped through the channels. Suddenly, he saw a familiar face. "Hey!" shouted Harold. "That's Mr. Meaner!" "What's he doing on TV?" cried George. He turned up the volume and the two boys watched Mr. Meaner's commercial in horror. "Are your kids annoying? Do they fight and whine and complain all the time? Do they refuse to eat anything but macaroni and cheese? Are they sucking the life out of you? Well, Riddle Kid 2000, trademarked, is here to help. Our scientifically proven formula will transform even the most willful child into an obedient, respectable, and hardworking servant, angel. And Riddle Kid 2000, trademarked, has a full day supply of vitamin C, so you can feel good about dosing your child with a narcotic that has never been tested for long-term effects. So turn your brat into a brown-noser with Riddle Kid 2000, trademarked. Riddle Kid 2000, trademarked, the cure for childhood. I knew something was wrong, said Harold, but it looks even worse than I'd imagined. We'd better go to school and get to the bottom of this, said George. But we're sick, cried Harold. I can't even breathe through my nose. Me neither, said George, but a kid's gotta do what a kid's gotta do. Chapter 15, Disguise Falling. George and Harold rummaged through their houses until they found what they needed. There was no way they were going to show up at school looking like themselves again. They learned that lesson in our last book. George and Harold needed a disguise, and it needed to be convincing. When they arrived at school, George changed into his costume behind the bushes and climbed onto Harold's shoulders. Then they headed into the building. Normally, any stranger entering Jerome Horowitz Elementary School would need to sign in at the office and go through a security screening. But George and Harold noticed that things at school were a little more relaxed today. Their first clue was that there were no adults in the office. At least it looked like that way. Upon closer inspection, they discovered that the school secretary, Miss Anthrop, was sound asleep on the floor under her desk. Some third graders were giving her a foot massage, while the 6th grade AV club was answering the phone and filing papers. That's weird, said George. As George and Harold walked down the hallway, things just got weirder and weirder. First, they noticed a brownish haze in the air. I wonder what that brown fog is all about, said George. I don't know, said Harold. I can't smell a thing because of my cold. Me neither, said George. As they roamed from room to room, they noticed that the other teachers were asleep too, and their students were doing all sorts of odd things for them. Some kids were giving the teachers massages, and others were shaving their teachers' beards, plucking their eyebrows, and giving them haircuts. The mathletes were filling out the teachers' tax forms, while the shop kids were washing all the cars in the faculty parking lot. Finally, George and Harold reached the cafeteria, where several teachers were lying on the lunch tables getting ashiatsu massages and mani-pedis at the same time. Boy, things sure have gotten a lot better around this place since Riddle Kid 2000, trademarked, came along, said Missouri. I'll say, said Ms. Guided, I was happy enough when my students were finally able to sit still and pay attention all day. But when I found out that they'd follow my every command without question, it changed my life. Mine too, said Miss Directed. I just sent my whole class over to my home. They're mowing my lawn, watering my garden, and painting my house as we speak. The 3 teachers all had a good laugh and drifted off into a relaxing, dreamy sleep. Oh no, cried George. The teachers have turned all the kids into mindless servants. We'd better get out of here before they turn us into servants too, said Harold. Okay, said George with a wicked smile. But first, let's have a little fun. Chapter 16, Happy Pranksgiving! If all the kids in school are blindly following the orders of adults, said George, then maybe they'll follow our orders too, since we're dressed like an adult. That makes sense, said Harold. Let's order everyone to stop following orders. Nah, said George. We've already used that joke in this book, fourth wall break. I've got a better idea. So George and Harold went around the school whispering new orders to all the students. First, they whispered some new orders to the kids who were giving out free shaves and haircuts. Are you sure? Asked the children. Of course I'm sure, said George. I'm an authority figure. Very well, sir, said the children. Next, they whispered some new orders to the kids who were filling out tax forms. Are you sure? Asked the children. I'm an adult, said George. Don't question me. All right, sir, said the children. Then they passed out permanent markers to another group of kids and whispered some new orders to them, too. Are you sure? Asked the children. Absolutely, said George. I'm a grown-up. I don't make mistakes. As you wish, said the children. The rest of the afternoon continued in much the same way, with George and Harold dishing out new orders to every kid they came across. We'd better get out of here, said Harold. Those teachers are going to wake up pretty soon, and they're not going to be very happy. Okay, said George. We can do the last one on our way home. As they headed back to their treehouse, George and Harold stopped by Misdirected's place. His whole yard was filled with children mowing the lawn, watering the flower garden, and painting the house. George whispered some new orders to them as well. "Are you sure?" asked the children. "Sure, we're sure," said George. "I mean, sure, I'm sure. Don't use your brains, just follow orders." Chapter 17, Wakey Wakey, Big Mistakey. George and Harold walked back to their treehouse feeling pretty good about themselves. But things were looking not so good for the teachers at school who were just waking up. "Hey," shouted Misanthrope, "somebody draw my face with permanent markers while I was asleep." "Mine too," shouted Misfit, "and they spray painted my rear end." "Me Stinky. Fingers go here, kick here." "Someone gave me a mohawk," cried Miss Ribble. "Somebody shaved on my eyebrows. Somebody shaved off my eyebrows and Goofy glued them to my chin," wailed Missouri. "Somebody mailed out my tax forms in Pig Latin and mailed them to the IRS," screamed Miss Labler. "Ismay Ablersley Oppy Rivet Pay." Miss Dakin rushed to the mirror. "Thank goodness nobody did anything to me," she laughed. "Hooray!" She really was mistaken. "Don't look now," cried Mr. Rustworthy, "but a bunch of kids are out in the parking lot filling up our cars with low-fat cottage cheese." The teachers all rushed to the windows. "What is the meaning of this?" they shouted. "We are following orders," said one of the children. "Who gave you those orders?" screamed Mr. Krupp. "An authority figure," said another kid. "We never question authority figures." The teachers were outraged. They marched across town to the old abandoned building that Mr. Meaner had converted into a Riddle Kid 2000 trademark spray can factory. "Look what those kids did to us!" Mr. Krupp shouted at Mr. Meaner. "That stupid stinky spray of yours doesn't work." "That's impossible," said Mr. Meaner. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this." Chapter 18, Low-Fat Rider. Mr. Meaner ran back to school, climbed into his low-fat cottage cheese-built car, and drove around the city. Even with his massive intelligent brain, he still couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. As he drove, he passed by a curious sight. A group of children were watering someone's house, mowing their flower garden, and painting their lawn. Mr. Meaner stopped his car and got out. "What on earth are you children doing?" he asked. "We are following orders," said one of the kids. "Who ordered you to do these things?" asked Mr. Meaner. "A grown-up," said the kid. "Grown-ups do not make mistakes." Mr. Meaner squished back into his car and peeled off. "No adult would give those kinds of orders," Mr. Meaner concluded. "This has to be the work of a child, and there's only one way to solve that problem." Mr. Meaner zoomed back into his factory and strapped himself into the Stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit he had been building all week. "Somewhere in this town there are children hiding," Mr. Meaner said, "and I'm gonna get 'em!" Chapter 19, Let Us Spray. The genius gym teacher stomped out of his factory and headed down the street, spraying everything in sight with his hideous mecha spray armpits. "Say hello to my stinky friends!" he shouted. The horrible brown clouds rose up over the city, getting bigger and billowier as they spread out across the town. After several hours, George and Harold could see the brown clouds from their treehouse window. "There's that brown fog again," said George. "It won't be long before it reaches our neighborhood." "It's a good thing our noses are clogged up," said Harold. "We can't smell it, so we're immune." "Yeah, but our colds won't last forever," said George. "I'm already starting to feel better." "Uh-oh," said Harold. "We need to find an adult we can trust. And fast." George and Harold had no other choice but to ask their parents for help. The two desperate boys sneaked into Harold's house where both of their families were sitting together just finishing up dinner. "Thanks for inviting us over for supper," said George's dad. "It's always a pleasure," said Harold's mom. "Please let us clear the table," said Yesterday George. "What a splendid idea," said Yesterday Harold. "Then we shall wash the dishes and mop the floor. Oh, what fun we shall have." George and Harold hid in the hallway, waiting for just the right moment to come in and tell everyone their terrible tale of woe. But before they got a chance, their parents began to talk. "I don't know what's come over those two boys lately," said George's dad, "but I like it." "Me too," said Harold's mom. "They've really grown up over these past few days." "It's like their whole personalities have changed," said George's mom. "What an improvement!" George and Harold looked at each other with sadness, then walked back to their treehouse broken-hearted. "Aw, man," said Harold. "Our parents like the new versions of us better than they like the us versions of us. We're going to have to find some adults who we can really trust," said George. "But who?" cried Harold. "I've got an idea," said George. George and Harold ran across town through the choking brown fog until they reached Melvin Sneedley's house. Luckily, Melvin's garage door was open. Even luckier, Melvin's glow-in-the-dark time-traveling robo-squid suits were there too. George climbed up into one of the cockpits and fired up the engine. The robo-squid suit lunged forward and grabbed Harold in its tentacled arm. Then it slithered down the sidewalk while George set the controllers. "You know, we really shouldn't be taking this," said Harold. "It isn't ours." "Technically, it is ours," said George. "Melvin only had one of these things, and we made the second one. You can't steal something you made yourself, can you?" "That's a good point," said Harold. George finished setting the controllers and pressed the start button. Then the robo-squid suit shook and sputtered, then disappeared into a ball of blinding light. Chapter 20. Away we go! George and Harold were instantly transported 20 years into the future. Quickly, they ran up to an old lady sitting with her 23-year-old son. "Look, son," said the old lady, "a giant glow-in-the-dark robotic squid is carrying a little boy in one of its tentacles." "Sure it is, Mom," said her son. "Listen, you need to take your medication every day, or it's not going to—" "Excuse me," said George. The 23-year-old looked up from his phone and screamed, "Ah! It's a giant glow-in-the-dark robotic squid carrying a little boy in one of its tentacles!" Yeah," said George. "Look, we need to borrow your phone. We're trying to locate George Beard." "You mean the author?" said the guy. Did you say author?" cried George excitedly. "Yeah," said the guy. "Everybody knows George Beard. He writes those Dogman graphic novels." "No way!" screamed George. He was so overcome with happiness he couldn't contain himself. The glow-in-the-dark time-traveling robo-squid suit jumped up and down, spun around, and danced a happy jig. "I write graphic novels in the future!" screamed George. "Oh yeah, I write graphic novels in the future!" "Settle down," cried Harold, who was starting to feel ill from all the dancing and jerking around. "You're acting too crazy, man. Show a little self-control, okay?" "Sorry," said George, setting Harold down. "Do you know where Mr. Beard lives?" George asked the guy. "Yeah, he lives up there on Echo Hills next to that graphic novel artist," said the guy. "I think his name is, Harold Hutchings or something." "I'm Harold Hutchings or something!" screamed Harold as he jumped up and down, flipped somersaults, and ran around in circles like a crazy person. "I illustrate graphic novels in the future! Oh, baby, I illustrate graphic novels in the future!" "Come on, Mr. Self-Control," said George. "Let's go meet our future selves." Zong. Chapter 21. It's nice to meet me. George and Harold could hardly contain themselves as they rang the doorbell of George's future self. They were so excited they had almost forgotten why they had come to the future in the first place. Soon, George's future self came to the door. He looked a lot like George, only he was really, really old. He was 30! Old George recognized George and Harold immediately. "Holy Toledo!" cried old George. "What are you guys doing here?" Old George's wife came to the door, too. "Don't be rude to your fans, honey," she said. "Invite them in. Make yourselves at home, boys." "These aren't my fans, dear," said old George. "They're us." "Us who?" asked Mrs. Beard. "It's Harold and me from when we were kids," said old George. George and Harold accepted Mrs. Beard's invitation and made themselves right at home. They gleefully tore through the house, checking all out of George and old George's stuff. "Your future house is awesome," said Harold. "Thanks," said George. "I must admit, I have pretty good taste." "Wow!" cried Harold. "You've even got your own pinball machine!" "Cool!" exclaimed George. "I've always wanted one." "Can I play it?" asked Harold. "I guess so," said George. "After all, it is mine." "Look, Harold," cried George. "There's even a tree house in my backyard." That's not for us," said old George. "That's for our kids." "Our kids?" asked George. "I guess it's time you boys met the whole family," said Mrs. Beard. "I'll go round up the children, honey, while you call Harold and Billy." Chapter 22. The gang's all here. The gang really is all here. Soon everyone had gathered together in old George's studio. Old George, his wife, and their kids Mina and Nick sat on the couch, while old Harold, his husband, and their twins, Owen and Kay, plopped down in the giant beanbag chair. "Kids," said Mrs. Beard, "I'd like you to meet your fathers." "What's up?" said George. "We're your dads when they were kids," said Harold. "Wow, Dad," said Mina. "You used to be cute." "What do you mean, used to be?" said old George. "We're here because we need to borrow your dads," said Harold. "They're the only adults we can trust." "Yeah," said George. "It's a real emergency." "Wait a minute," said old Harold. "I don't remember doing any of this when we were kids. Do you, George?" No, said old George. If this happened in our past, how come we no memory of it? I don't know, said Harold. Probably bad writing, said George. Self-burn. Well, if we're going to help you, we better get going, said old George. Let's boogie. But wait, said Harold. We need to finish our pinball game. Yeah, said George. And we haven't even read your graphic novels yet. I thought this was an emergency, said old Harold. How about just one chapter, Harold begged. Please? Well, all right, said old Harold. George and Harold grabbed a graphic novel from the bookshelf, flipped it open, and started reading from a random chapter. And if we look at the closer details in the Dogman, the Bark Knight Cometh book, the back reads, Is this the end of Dogman? A sinister spree of cat burglary has hit the town, and it has Petey's paw prints all over it. But Petey is still locked up in cat jail. Who is committing these terrible crimes? Where have they hidden the chief? And why have they unleashed an army of venomous robotic Venus flytrap monkeys? It's Dogman's greatest caper yet, and he's nowhere to be found. Who will save us now? Doggone good, and the greatest graphic novel of the century. The word century is spelled incorrectly on George Beard's mom's review. Chapter 23, Dogman, the random chapter. No, Dogman, no! Bad Dogman! How could you betray us like this, Dogman? Because I'm not Dogman. Fling! Rustle, rustle. Actually, I'm Petey, the world's most incorrigible cat. Petey, I thought you were dead. That's what I wanted you to think. But what happened to Dogman? Dogman is the one who was dead. Zip! My Venus flytrap monkeys have surely finished him off by now. Shong, and now, dear coppers, it is your turn to die. Whoosh, clunk. Hey, you broke my sword! You owe me $16. Crack. Whoosh, shoom. Do you give up, or do you want some more? Pow! Wah! So, you want to play rough, eh? Behold the rage and fury of my rocket fists. Whoosh! Hey, you're not Petey, you're Mecha Petey. Mecha Petey? I thought he was dead. That's what I wanted you to think. Pop, pop, bok. And now you shall witness the defeat of the Bark Knight. Not if I can help it. Millie, don't be a hero. Don't be a fool with your life. Clunk. My mask. Hey, you're not Mecha Petey. No. This whole time it's been me, Flippy, the world's most sinister psychokinetic fish. And I wanted to mention this detail for a quick second. If we compare the full color remake to the original published edition of this book, we can see that Flippy's name was originally meant to be Pork Belly. And also another detail is that the original version of this book calls him an angelfish, while Flippy is meant to be a butterfly fish. Flippy? I thought he was dead! That's what I wanted you to think! To be continued. Chapter 24. Away we go! Again. Well, said old George, what'd you think? Did you like it? I guess so, said Harold. Yeah, said George. It was pretty good. For old people. Pretty good? Cried old Harold. Old people? Cried old George. All right, let's boogie, said George as he went to the front yard and powered up the Robo-Squid suit. Quickly, he reached out 3 mechanical arms and picked up old Harold, and old George. Suddenly, everything began to shake and sputter as a massive ball of electric light enveloped them all. Are you guys ready to go? Asked Harold. Pretty good, whined old Harold. Old people, whined old George. As our heroes began to disappear into the shifting paradigms of time, they waved goodbye to their frightened families. Don't worry, kid, shouted George. We'll all be back by chapter 38. Another fourth wall break. Chapter 25. It was 20 years ago today. Everything stopped suddenly, and George, Harold, and their future selves looked down from the vacant hilltop. They were back in the present, and the entire city below them was surrounded by a gigantic, stinky brown cloud. Quickly, they made their way through the dark clouds to their treehouse. Wow, cried old George. I haven't been up here in years. Look, cried old Harold. It's Tony, Orlando, and Dawn. I remember them. Yeah, whatever happened to them, said old George. It was like they just disappeared one day. I don't know what you're talking about, said Harold. They've always been here, ever since they hatched. Listen, boys, said old George. You need to stay up here. We'll take care of Mr. Meaner and his stinky gas. Yeah, said old Harold. It's up to the adults to save the world this time. Chapter 26. Stinkalicious. The first thing that old George and old Harold did was run to Mr. Krupp's house. Unfortunately, Mr. Meaner was walking down Mr. Krupp's street at that very moment in his stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit, blowing brown putrid fog throughout the neighborhood. Old George rang Mr. Krupp's doorbell, panicking. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp swung at the front door open. He'd been at his kitchen sink all evening, scrubbing the permanent marker off of his face. "What do you people want?" shouted Mr. Krupp. "We'll need the help of an old friend," said old Harold, snapping his fingers. Snap! "Well," Mr. Krupp screamed, "answer me!" Old George and old Harold looked at each other in shock. "It didn't work!" cried old Harold. They both snapped their fingers this time. Snap, 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 snap! "Hey!" Mr. Krupp screamed. "Quit snapping your fingers in my face, you weirdos!" Mr. Meaner and his stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit were getting closer. Snap, 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 snap! The whole street shook with every forceful stomp of his metallic monkey feet. Old George and old Harold continued snapping their fingers feverishly. "Why isn't it working?" cried old Harold as he snapped. "It must be all that water that's on his face," cried old George. "That's got to be what's keeping him up from transforming." "Listen up, you two psychos!" Mr. Krupp screamed. "You better get out of my yard before I call the cops. You're supposed to be adults, but you're acting like a couple of kids." Does he know? Suddenly, Mr. Meaner stopped. "Adults acting like kids?" he said, turning his head slyly. He looked at old George and old Harold. His genius brain began to calculate rapidly as he eyed them up and down. Then his face widened with a sinister, foul-smelling smile. "Adults who act like children would be immune to my Riddle Kid 2000 trademark spray," Mr. Meaner said. "So they must be the pranksters I've been looking for." Mr. Meaner stomped up to old George and old Harold and grabbed the two friends in the clenching claws of the stinky Kong 2000. Chapter 27, the incredibly graphic violence chapter part 1 in Flipperama trademarked. Introducing Flipporama. Incredibly graphic violence is lots of fun, unless you're the star. We hope you'll enjoy these next few pages. We won't. The first time ever I punched your face, killing me softly with his Kong. Chapter 28, Don't Go Breaking My Spine. With the help of his stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit, Mr. Meaner was victorious. He picked up old George and old Harold in his mighty metallic fist and began to squeeze. "Hey, don't kill those guys!" cried Mr. Krupp as he dried his face on an old red towel with black dots on it. "You'll ruin my lawn!" He's just dried his face," old Harold gasped. "Now's our chance!" Snap, snap! Old George and old Harold reached out weakly and snapped their fingers. Snap, snap! Suddenly, a silly smile spread across Mr. Krupp's freshly dried face. Quickly, he tore off his clothes and tied his red towel around his neck. The battle of the century was about to begin. Chapter 29, the incredibly graphic violence chapter part 2 in Flipperama trademarked. Somebody done somebody's Kong wrong. I fight the Kongs that make the whole world stink. Chapter 30, Pequa Prison Blues. The stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit was destroyed, and soon Mr. Meaner found himself sitting in a cell at Pequa State Penitentiary. Warden Gordon Borden Schmorden stopped by to have a word with Mr. Meaner. Warden Gordon Borden Schmorden was in our 9th book. "Well, well, well," said Warden Schmorden smugly. "It looks like your days of giving orders to people are over." "Go make me an egg salad sandwich," said Mr. Meaner. "Okay," said Warden Schmorden, "coming right up. Do you see the irony right here? And don't forget the dill pickle relish," said Mr. Meaner. "I wouldn't dream of forgetting that, sir," said Warden Schmorden. 5 minutes later, Warden Gordon Borden Schmorden returned with a lovely egg salad sandwich loaded with dill pickle relish. And it was established earlier in this book that Zygogogozizzle 24, which is in the sandwich, could be mixed with dill pickle relish. Mr. Meaner grabbed it and scarfed it all down. Suddenly, Mr. Meaner's body began to change. The mayonnaise and the dill pickle relish began to combine with the Zygogogozizzle 24 that had taken over Mr. Meaner's body. Which was I trying to say? First, he began to vibrate and glow as tiny sparks of electricity shot out of his fingers and toes. Then he started growing. Mr. Meaner grew and grew and grew to such a gigantic size he crashed out of his gel and pushed his way through the side of the jail. Mr. Meaner had transformed into a highly intelligent blob of pure energy. "I am Sir Stinks-a-Lot," he bellowed as he zapped everything around him with cataclysmic crackles of electricity. Chapter 31, Ooze On Down the Road. Sir Stinks-a-Lot slithered sloppily down the street looking for sweet, sweet revenge. "Captain Underpants," he called out mockingly, "come out and play!" Suddenly, Captain Underpants swooped in and smashed Sir Stinks-a-Lot right on the noggin with a telephone pole. The gigantic evil blob zapped his lightning rays and swung his mighty fist, but Captain Underpants was just too quick. Old George and Old Harold stood on the sidelines cheering for the waistband warrior. "Get him, Captain Underpants!" shouted Old George. "Let's win this thing so we can all go home!" shouted Old Harold. Splat! Sir Stinks-a-Lot was getting very frustrated and annoyed. Then he thought of something really smart. "Those two guys seem to know Captain Underpants pretty well," said Sir Stinks-a-Lot to himself. "I think it's time to find out exactly what they know." Sir Stinks-a-Lot raised his terrifying fist above Old George and Old Harold. Wham! Then clobbered them with a powerful punch. Quickly, the energy inside Sir Stinks-a-Lot's body began to absorb Old George and Old Harold. The two old friends began to merge with the evil glob of energy, and soon the three had become one. "Ha! Ha! Ha!" laughed Sir Stinks-a-Lot. "I've absorbed their bodies and their memories. Soon I'll know everything that they know." Sir Stinks-a-Lot used his massive glowing brain to quickly sort through Old George's and Old Harold's memories. He learned how they first met, he learned how they became friends, and he learned how they created Captain Underpants. Unfortunately, Sir Stinks-a-Lot also learned how to destroy Captain Underpants. A sinister sneer stretched across the blobby face of the supremely intelligent supervillain. Swiftly, he oozed over to Fran's pond, chuckling maniacally to himself. "You better let those guys go," shouted Captain Underpants, "or I'm gonna—" "You're not going to do anything!" screamed Sir Stinks-a-Lot as he swished his mighty hand into the pond and set a gigantic splash of water flying into the air. Swish! Chapter 32, The Night the Lights Went Out in Pequot. The massive spray of water hit Captain Underpants with a powerful sploosh. Suddenly, our hero's confidence disappeared and he fell screaming from the sky. "Kirk Cameron! Ah!" he shrieked as he tumbled to the ground and smashed into the earth with a terrifying sound effect. "Hey, I'm okay," said Mr. Krupp as he sat up and dusted himself off. "Wait a minute," said Sir Stinks-a-Lot. "He's not even hurt! How could that be?" Sir Stinks-a-Lot reached down and touched Mr. Krupp with one of his gigantic glowing fingers. A powerful burst of zygogogozizzlistic energy zapped forth from his massive fingertip and scanned Mr. Krupp's body. Quickly, the villain's bulbous brain analyzed each and every strand of DNA in Mr. Krupp's body until a foreign substance was detected. "So," shouted Sir Stinks-a-Lot, "you've got alien superpower juice in your DNA. I guess I'll just have to extract it." Sir Stinks-a-Lot's finger grew brighter and brighter as he performed one of the most complicated laser surgeries ever. A Mountain Dew-ectomy. I mean a superpower juice-ectomy. Carefully, he removed all the superpowered elements from Mr. Krupp's DNA and absorbed them all into his massive glowing body. Mr. Krupp was unharmed, but he ran home screaming anyway. "Now I've got superpowers," laughed Sir Stinks-a-Lot, "and now I am truly unstoppable." Chapter 33. I'm sending out good vibrations. What Sir Stinks-a-Lot failed to realize, however, was that Old George and Old Harold were still a part of him. Since they had all merged together, the two best friends' brains were now filled with superpowered Zygogogozizzle-24. It wasn't long before Old George and Old Harold had soared through every particle of Zygogogozizzle-24 and every glowing jewel of energy that made up their hulkingly monstrous body. Soon they knew everything, from the chemical makeup of their archenemy to the events that led to the destruction of Smart Earth. Old George and Old Harold oozed up from the back of Sir Stinks-a-Lot's head and started sending a message. The two old friends thought as hard as they could, and soon a telepathic signal radiated from their gooey heads to their old treehouse, miles away. Unfortunately, George and Harold were sound asleep. They didn't pick up the telepathic message at all. Luckily, someone else did. Tony, Orlando, and Don swooshed out of the treehouse and headed for a nearby shopping center. The fate of the entire planet was in their tiny paws. Chapter 34, Laughter Moon Delight. Sir Stinks-a-Lot had been victorious, and now it was time to gloat. "I just defeated the world's greatest superhero! And now I'm the most intelligent, most powerful entity the world has ever seen!" He oozed over to his Riddle Kid 2000 trademark factory and kissed it gently on the roof. "Soon my stinky spray will take over the brains of all the children on Earth," he shouted. "I'll be their leader, and they'll gladly obey my every command!" Sir Stinks-a-Lot threw back his hideously huge head and laughed and laughed and laughed. "Ha, ha, 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 ha!" And look what Tony, Orlando, and Don are doing with the Pop Rocks, the Diet Coke, and the Mentos. And they're bringing it further into the insides of Mr. Meaner. Chapter 35, to make a long story short, Chef Goldplume! That's right, Mr. Meaner just explodes due to the volatile concoction of Mentos, Pop Rocks, and Diet Coke. Chapter 36, Stuck in the Puddle with You. The terrible explosion blasted Sir Stinks-a-Lot's body apart, releasing a powerful electromagnetic pulse and launching the superpower juice in the Zygogogozizzle-24 deep in outer space. The factory was destroyed, the Riddle Kid 2000 trademark had disintegrated, and all that was left was a big stinky mess. A crowd of people gathered around Fran's pond to view the horrible glob of devastation. Suddenly, the glob began to bubble and move. Then old George and old Harold climbed out of its gooey center. They were completely unharmed. Hooray! Shouted the crowd of people. The glob began to bubble and move again. All at once, Tony, Orlando, and Don popped out. They were fine also. Yippee! Cheered the crowd of people. Finally, the glob bubbled and moved one last time, and Mr. Meaner popped his head out. He was back to his old self, too. Aw, man, moaned the crowd of people. Gym teachers suck, am I right? Chapter 37, Back to Normal. George and Harold woke up to the rising sun and looked out their treehouse window. The whole city looks like it's back to normal, said George. Even the stinky brown clouds had disappeared, said Harold. It was a good thing, too, because George's and Harold's colds had finally gone away. The two friends climbed down from their treehouse and looked in Harold's bedroom window. Yesterday, Harold was still sound asleep. Soon, the Riddle Kid 2000 trademark would wear off, and yesterday, George and yesterday, Harold would be back to normal. George and Harold walked out to the front yard where they saw some familiar faces. What happened? Cried Harold. Is everything okay? Of course it is, said old George. Yeah, said old Harold. Adults can be heroes, too, you know. Old George and old Harold told their younger selves all about their greatest adventure while they walked toward Echo Hills together. Out on the way, they passed Mr. Krupp. He was outside in his yard raking the grass as a jogger ran by, snapping her fingers. Snap, 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 snap. You stay away from my yard, Mr. Krupp shouted. What's going on? Cried Harold. Mr. Krupp just heard somebody snap their fingers, and he didn't turn into you-know-who. I have no idea how that happened, said old George. Perhaps it was the electromagnetic pulse that erased the hypnotic spell from Mr. Krupp's brain. Or maybe it happened during the superpower juicectomy. Nobody knew for sure, but for some strange reason, Mr. Krupp was now back to normal too. Soon our heroes arrived at Echo Hills and prepared to return to the future. Thanks for all of your help last night, said George. Yeah, said Harold. You guys did a pretty good job. For old people. Pretty good, cried old Harold. Old people, cried old George. Chapter 38. Home again, naturally. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light. 20 years flashed forward in an instant, and the empty hilltop was now filled with homes and trees. Old George's and old Harold's families were all there too, anxiously waiting for their return. It was a joyful reunion. Well, said Harold, I think we'd better go back home. You know, said George, we don't actually have to go home. What do you mean? Asked Harold. We've got our own time machine, said George. We could go anywhere we want. We could explore time together. We can go on awesome new adventures. Wow, said Harold. That sounds like fun. What should we do first? Asked Harold. Let's go rescue Crackers and Sulu, said George. The three baby hamster dactyls flapped their wings with excitement. How in the world are we ever going to do that? Asked Harold. We'll figure something out, said George as he set the controllers. We always do. George and Harold and their happy pets waved goodbye to their future families, and together they all disappeared into a ball of brilliant light. Chapter 39. Meanwhile, back in the present, a few hours had passed, and the Riddle Kid 2000 trademark had finally worn off. Yesterday George and yesterday Harold were back to their old selves again, but nothing around them seemed normal at all. I wonder where George and Harold went, said yesterday George. I have no idea, said yesterday Harold. And where did Tony, Orlando, and Don go? Asked yesterday George. Beats me, said yesterday Harold. It seems like they just disappeared. Yesterday George and yesterday Harold didn't know what had happened or why everything had turned out okay, but it seemed like things were going to be just fine from now on, and they were very grateful. Well, what should we do now? Asked Harold. Let's make a new comic book, said George. About Captain Underpants? Asked Harold. Nah, said George. Let's do something different. How about a Dogman comic? Okay, said Harold happily. And together the two friends wrote and drew and laughed all afternoon.